So upon researching how different companies around the world structure their design teams, specifically around design systems, I realized that a lot of them use the last one, which is the cyclical system. And that's the same kind of model we adopted when I was at Emirates NBD. Essentially, this means you have a small core team that is fully committed to the design system, but that small core team is supported by various other team members on whether it's various projects or other departments within the organization. So it creates an efficient way of keeping your finger on the pulse of what's happening within the whole organization without having to hire a large team specifically for the design system, because that can obviously be a costly affair. So what I want to talk about now is the basics of design systems. And I wanted to start here because it's important to see how the basics we implement as design decisions, how those decisions cascade down when it comes to actually implementing them in development. So I'll be covering base grids, typography, and color. And typically when you're creating a design system, you need to decide whether it's going to be a base 4 design system or base 8. Most design systems will use both. So base 4 could be used for typography, base 8 for visual rhythm in your design components. So typically you use both. When it comes to typography, you can use a tool like Tim Brown's modular scale. I find these tools, online tools, very useful. So essentially you start with your base size. Most browsers use 16 pixels as a base font size. So that's always a good place to start. But this could be anything that's determined by your brand. So for example, it could be 14 instead of 16. You then pick your scale. My personal favorite is usually the augmented fourth scale. That's why I have it highlighted there. But there are various different scales that you see under scale options there. So choosing this, using this tool to create your typography scales ensures that you have a nice visual rhythm when it comes to how your typography increases in scale. So it's a very useful tool that helps you decide as a design team, make those decisions. And the end result is, out of all those scales that are produced by modular scale, you can pick the ones that are most relevant to your design language. So in this example, I've only picked 7 of all of them. Moving on to color, I've kind of highlighted the main categories that I find are usually prevalent in most design systems. So the ones that are above that line are what most design systems will have. The ones below that line are nice to haves that are relevant depending on what kind of product you're building. So how you come up with colors is extremely important as well, in terms of how you define your shades and your tints, because you need to create a scale or a system that's scalable. So in this example, let's say your primary brand color is a blue color, like the circles there, and you need to extrapolate 5 shades out of that one blue color. So what you would do is you can add layers on top of that. So starting with a dark layer in the beginning for your dark shade, and adding layers of white at varying degrees of opacity that you set as a design team. So in this example, I'm increasing my opacity by 20% each time. Some brands will use 25%, some brands will use 30%. It's up to the design team to decide. But the end result is you have extrapolated 5 colors with the exact same hue from that primary brand color, which is, in this case, is labeled 400. So if you do this for all the colors in your color palette, you end up with quite a rich color palette to work with in your design. So the reason I wanted to mention the naming conventions for the color palettes, which was the 500 going down to 100, is that really helps when you're now scaling out your design system to include tokens. What are tokens? So design tokens are typically named entities that store some kind of visual design attribute. So these could be font sizes, hex codes for colors, your code for that controls the elevation or shadows, could be animation transitions, etc. Basically, any attributes you can think of can be attributed to a token. And the word token itself actually refers to two things. So it's a combination of a key and a value, where the key represents what that token is, and that's the value you'd use in your development. And the second part of the token is the value, which actually determines what that token outputs. So in this example, you have a token for the brand primary color, which has a hex value of 058882. Now, the problem with this naming convention, if we kind of segue into naming conventions, is looking at that token, you have no idea what that color is, unless you have like a photographic memory and you memorize all possible combination of hex codes, which I don't think is a skill anyone possesses. It becomes very difficult to use a token that's named this way, because it's not readable by human standard. So instead of using what brand guidelines usually have, which is primary, secondary, tertiary colors, what you can do instead is actually name the tokens in a readable manner. So in this example, instead of primary, secondary, tertiary, you can actually name them purple, maroon, and aqua. And as you start doing this, you can actually see that by layering in your token naming, you can actually provide broad and specific contextual uses of that token within your system. And what I mean by that is, if you simply append the scale that determines what shade that color is to your token, you actually start to extrapolate more meaning from it. So in this example, I've added 100, 200, 300 to the token named purple. And given the previous slide that I had with the blue shades, you can immediately visualize that purple 100 is the lightest, and it gets darker as you get to purple 500. You can then use those initial kind of atomic tokens and have them as the value to another token. So in the middle example, you have your primary background color being purple 200, and your primary text color being purple 300. So you can see you can actually start layering these token names and giving them contextual meaning based on their usage. So when you're sitting in a meeting, for example, where you have a room of developers and designers and other business stakeholders, you can all speak the same language when you're referring to some of these tokens and values, because all you have to say is the primary button background color token needs to be updated to the new brand color, and everyone will know what you're talking about. So how does this look like in code? So this is an example of a Sass file called variables.scss. So Sass is basically a form of CSS that you compile into normal CSS. It's like a preprocessor. So in this example, I'm giving an example of an Angular project as the front-end tool or front-end platform for building this particular product. So I'm going to be giving an example of how you can apply these concepts within an Angular framework. And the reason I chose Angular is that's the one I had exposure to when I created this deck a few months ago. This obviously applies to any front-end development framework you'd be using, whether it's Angular, React, or in fact, just pure HTML and CSS. So you'll see here that I've listed all my tokens with a name that kind of lets you know what that token is. And some of them, like the second, like the third and fourth one, are actually bound to the tokens above them. So the primary color for the whole project is bound to the Sankofa Aqua base token. So this is kind of how you'd set up tokens in a variables.scss file. When it comes to your shadows and elevation, you can actually start to see how this plays out from an interaction point of view. So none of these shadows in the CSS is actually hard-coded. You'll see that all the properties are bound to tokens. So you've got elevation levels 2, 3, and 4. And the way it works in this scenario is any object that has elevation 2, when you interact with it, be it a hover or a tap, it will move to elevation 3. If a component starts with elevation 3, then if you interact with it, it moves to elevation 4. So it's a very intuitive way of naming these tokens and as well as applying them to your hover states within your actual interactions. So I showed you the elevation.scss and the variables.scss, but this can be expanded to house code for all your properties. So just from an organizational point of view, you'll see that I have files, SCSS files for specific things within the application. So I've got one that controls all the buttons, all the cards, and all the charts. And all of these reference the last file at the bottom there, which is variables.scss, which is why it's in a different color. It's set up as a root file. So any value within variables.scss is accessible outside of that file. So that's why in elevation before, in elevation.scss, I could actually reference the elevation level 3 token, even though it's not explicitly defined within this file, but it's defined in the variables.scss. So it's a great way of organizing your files. And that's how kind of tokens would work when you're defining them in your code. So an example also of how you can start speaking the same language is naming conventions within code and your design files. So in this example, I've given Sketch as an example. So if you had a card component within your pattern library in Sketch, you could name that component cards / or \vertical. And the same component, when it's now built out in Angular, could have a similar name. So it could be cards / vertical. So that means developers and designers actually reference the same component when they're speaking, whether it's to each other or presenting these components to stakeholders. You can all start speaking the same language. So when you break down how each component is actually built, you'll see that none of the values should be hard-coded. So the background color, border radius, text color, the elevation or the shadow, the padding within that holding container, everything is bound to a token. And typically this is best practice because you don't want to hard code values because changing one thing will cascade that change throughout your app if you're using tokens in this way. So because I'm showing you a card component, I'll give you a snippet of how the card.scss file would look like. So like I was saying, you've got the card CSS that controls how that card looks. So at the top there, you'll see you've got your WebKit box shadow values that reference elevation level 4. So that's what I have there under box shadow elevation. So all of these values are bound to variables or tokens that you set in your variables.scss file. And that's how you start kind of building a scalable design system. So that's Angular, but how does it look like when you're building a mobile app? So it's a similar workflow in that Android and iOS have tokens as well that are implemented in a similar way. And how a design team actually outputs these is through a tool called Style Dictionary. So Style Dictionary is just one example of something you can use. And what typically teams have to do is you create what are called JSON files that have all your tokens defined within them. So I've given an example on the right where you've got your color brand blue 300 with its value and a comment that describes what that token is. And what nested within that are your 4, 200, and 100 values as well. So when you input this as an input into style dictionary, what it then does is it outputs these tokens and compiles them into their respective formats for each platform. So you'll see there I have XML, plist, and CSS, which is essentially what iOS and Android would use. So Android uses XML format and iOS uses plist. Because you find that, for example, pixel values and hex codes aren't usable in Android and iOS because they don't use hex codes to determine color, and they don't use pixels as values. Android will use DP and SP, for example, and iOS will use points. So instead of having to do all that work manually, of manually converting all your tokens to their respective formats, it's much more efficient just to create one source of truth, which would be using hex codes and pixel values. And you feed that into a tool like Style Dictionary that then outputs the relevant format for each platform. So it saves a lot of time and energy. And this can obviously be applied to any type of token. So instead of colors, you can do it with your typography as well, where the font name, the font size, line height, and letter spacing are all explicitly defined within your tokens. So when you're now actually developing your application, this is an example of how we did it at MSMBD. So we had 2 different repositories for code. We had one code repository specifically for components. An example is what you see there. So we had a separate app altogether that simply was like a component playground app. So you'll see there on the left with on the iPhone mockups, you'll see all the categories of components. So in the middle there, you'll see all your primary button, secondary button, tertiary buttons, etc. So this one app would read from the repository for components and show you interactive components from that repository. So you can actually open this app and start tapping and clicking on components to see how they behave. And we actually use this as a tool to QA components that were being built within our teams. So the design team could go here and actually see if the component was developed according to what the design team's vision was. And when it came to actually developing the screens themselves, the dev teams that were responsible for building out UI screens would then grab code from the component repository into their screen repository and build out the screens using that, which meant we had to only maintain the component repository and update that in order to cascade the changes across all the different apps that we're using that one repository. So it's quite an efficient way of setting up your design system to have a repo specifically for components that both design and development teams can maintain and test and make sure that the quality that's coming out of the components is of a high standard. So I wanted to end off by talking about what the future looks like for design systems. So the Internet of Things, which is a conversation that started a few years ago, but is still very relevant today, is we're becoming more connected. So we're connecting more things in our lives. And that's actually giving a rise to a broader spectrum of design system artifacts. So I always give the example of a company like Spotify, who when Spotify started out, they only had to really worry about streaming music to mobile devices, for instance, and laptops and computers. But if you look at how their teams are built now, they've got design teams around the world that are specific to specific platforms. So you'll find they've got design teams for streaming Spotify on a fridge, or a design team for streaming Spotify in smart vehicles or microwaves, because we're starting to see a lot of household appliances that are connected to the internet and therefore are being used to stream news and music and any manner of information. So our design systems are having to evolve quite quickly. And of particular interest to me is Neuralink. So if some of you are familiar with the company Elon Musk founded about 3 years ago called Neuralink, essentially it's a company dedicated to creating a brain-machine interface. And the reason I'm kind of singling this one out is it gives rise to the question of what design teams will be designing in the future and what dev teams will be designing in the future. Because if you have Spotify as an example, if we have a brain-machine interface implanted within us, then you'll be able to stream Spotify directly to your brain, which essentially means you'll be able to interface with Spotify without having to use your fingers, which is how you have to do it now, because it's directly streamed to your brain. And what does that look like from a design system perspective? What artifacts do you have to create? How do you extend your design principles and your tokens to accommodate an interface like something we've never seen before? So it's just something to think of the future of design and where design systems are going. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Batsy. That was very helpful. I really like your presentation.
Thank you.
I hope everyone found it useful too. So now we're gonna head to Q&A, and the first question is for Jay. So this is from Martin, and Martin is asking that we as designers, we often get pushed with the main objectives to hit the goals by the senior management. So usually in many companies, a senior management will push the designer that you should achieve this conversion rate or achieve this number of acquisition. And it's about how should the conversation be with management and designers when it comes to a bottom-down way of handling the goals or the metrics.
Thanks, Özlem. I think from kind of my perspective and kind of experience kind of with things like this is you need to be able to read the room. So if you have leadership within your company who are very open to suggestions, for example, and they're open to hearing the voices of their colleagues, then I would have an open conversation directly kind of with them and say that you want to achieve that objective, but you want to be able to do it in the right way, or you want the space to be able to conduct some research first so that you can find the right solution that serves the customer in the best way possible. And I would just be very kind of upfront with that and just say,